Lionel has for many years been exploring the evolutionary roots of human behavior, especially in men, which is why he is the lone male who will actually give a talk on the stage in these proceedings. Not the entertainers, right? That was my big wrinkle thought. The speakers would be women and the entertainers would be men. It was late at night. So I turned to Lionel in my despair, also because he had, over the years, written a series of important and actually amazingly successful books. His first book, Men in Groups, was a commercial smash, completely unexpected. He then followed with books about optimism, about pleasure, and finally a book on the decline of males, and that's why he's here. And he introduced us to Christine Somers, and he agreed to come here and bail out his old buddy, Lionel Tiger.
Big problem, Moses, is that I'm actually going to be the entertainment, and but I have a series of ill-assorted, pathetic jokes, and if you disapprove of my rendition of them, don't leave, because I believe there's coffee appearing afterwards. But let me try to carry on what Christina Somers did, but more importantly, in terms of perspective, what the first two speakers did, which was talk about the internal biological mechanisms which make us and which sustain us. First of all, on the issue of male-female differences, 1969, the first book that Moses mentioned, Men in Groups, it was reviewed in the New York Times, and the reviewer titled the review, The Startling Rediscovery of the Obvious. And I thought that was actually a compliment, because generally the obvious stares us in the face and we don't see it. I want to restate something obvious now, which is that we have got really to stop with this feminism. We have got to stop with this female affirmative action, as Somers said. We have got to stop assigning to males what I called in my Decline of Males book, male original sin. If you're born male, you're ipso facto defective. At my university, Rutgers in New Jersey, and at countless universities, perhaps all in the United States, and I dare say in Canada, the first thing that happens to a young male when he comes to the university or to college is a rape seminar. He's instructed by lawyers and by moral custodians that he's a predatory, dangerous animal, and he had best behave. Now, I understand fully the consequences of not assigning some sense of responsibility here. I'm not denying that this is an issue, all too tragically, all too often, but the fact is that the institutional framework of receiving a young male who's coming away from home for the first time is one that stigmatizes him in his own mind and in view also of the females who are in that class as well. Let me just make one comment about turning boys into girls. One of the techniques that's used widely in the United States, certainly, and I suspect here too, in the school system, is the assignment of drugs. Ritalin, for example. 90% of the victims of Ritalin are boys. This is an astonishing figure. Ritalin is a very powerful drug. In France, it's equivalent to cocaine or heroin as an accessible drug. We just give it out. School nurses give it out. I want to talk about why this situation emerged, and I would like to return to the biology. When I lived in London, I was actually a supporter of the Abortion Law Reform Association, and I was in the House of Commons when that bill was passed, because I thought it was so important to have legislation of that sort. The more so because a friend of mine who'd gotten pregnant from a feckless guy and didn't want the child came to my apartment to be in a location where the hospital that would pick her up after the backstreet abortion could treat her well. And I'll never forget, she was taken by these two burly ambulance guys saying, "It'll be all right, love. It'll be fine, love. It'll be fine, love." And I remember thinking, do we need this? That woman has gone on to be one of the most distinguished actresses in Canada, but what was important was that birth was a major responsibility, and she had to deal with something that she thought would have been unfair to her life cycle. I then got interested in the pill when it emerged, and I thought that, wait a minute, women on the pill don't get pregnant, but why? Because they're pregnant. They're chemically pregnant. And so with some colleagues at the Rutgers Medical School, we did a study of monkeys, and I won't go into the details, but essentially we demonstrated to perfect success that the ingestion of Depo-Provera, which we were using because you could give a 3-month subcutaneous dosage of it, completely extinguished the sexual behavior of the male that was breeding, copulating frequently and enthusiastically with 3 of the 9 females. When we medicated those females, he stopped. He didn't know why. He poked them, he sniffed them, he shook them. No buzz. As a consequence, led me to believe, and my co-workers, that there was something in the human pill that might be having a similar effect. My image is if a young guy gets his best suit on and his best Brill cream and platform heels, if he can figure them out, and he goes to the biggest disco in town, and the disco light is going, and it's great music, and there's promise of beer in the corner, and he looks around and all the females are pregnant. Because post-pill, they were. Now, what's the consequence for the male of this? We think now it's pheromonal, that it has a real impact. Let's go back to the history. I'm referring now to the American history because I've lived there for a long time. The Canadian issue is much more complex. The tribulations of Henry Morgentaler and so on are an index of the complexity of the Canadian system as compared in this context with the American. Pill comes into general play in 1963, roughly at that time. What happens 10 years later in the US? Guess what? Roe versus Wade. Tell me why 10 years after we have a good, cheap contraceptive do we have to pass this very controversial still bill in the Congress? What's the reason? Well, we know from historical parish records and the like that, say at the turn of the last century, about 30 to 50% of marriages occurred with a pregnancy. It's easy to figure out. If you can count to 9, you look at when the wedding is, and when the baby's born, you nail it. Now, this is a perfectly good reproductive strategy because the male and the female, obviously the parts fit, they can at least abide each other for 40 or 50 seconds at a minimum, and they produce a child, and if the male is recalcitrant, the old shotgun is brought back from the duck hunting department and put in front of him, and he marries her. I'm not making any moral comment here, but we know that's what happened. Suddenly, what biologists call the reproductive strategy, which is a time-tested and effective one of many females and males, is no longer quite so effective. Susie comes home or visits with George and says, "George, I got great news for us." "Oh, really? What is it?" "We're pregnant." "We?" says George. Now, before the pill, the principal contraceptive was the condom. I know I was there. If you didn't use one, you knew what the consequences might be. After then, the issue became a much more conjectural one and much more, as it should be, a female right and a female choice. So then the system changed. Women took their bras off, began wearing miniskirts. The sex was in the air. Something was going on or trying to go on to keep the system flourishing. And one consequence of that is that women have understood that they have to take care of themselves. No one else will. Currently, 40% of all babies born in the industrial world are born to women who are not married. I'm not making a moral judgment. These women have somehow decided that the miraculous business we just heard about creating a new human being, does not necessarily require an automatic male. And I think, as Summers says, Dr. Summers indicated, one reason women are doing so well at university, college, professional schools, and so on, is that they're studying for two. Any sensible young woman, without actually articulating it, will figure out rather rapidly that given this 40% figure I cited, she may well have to take care of her own child if she wants to have one. And some 80 to 85% of women still do have them and may still want to have them. So women have adjusted to what we in biology call a reproductive strategy by saying, well, okay, I don't really need a man. I don't. We can get impregnated every which way. I'm not sure I see the advantage of doing it in a lab when actually it's kind of amusing to do it in a bedroom or anywhere else you choose. But the fact is that things have changed at the fundamental reproductive level, and I don't think anything will ever be the same. Meanwhile, we have, as Summers indicated, a kind of toxic attitude to males. A journalist at the Toronto Star interviewed me about some comments I made about the need to have male studies at universities. And he looked at the University of Toronto catalog and found that there were 40 members of faculty doing women's studies, 2 studying men, and these were men studying homosexual men. That's it. The University of Toronto in that context is kind of negligent. It would be as if it were doing the study of tires, but it only studied the right side. And working as I do in a university system, I would be quite churlish and say there should be an embargo on any more women's studies programs. They should be frozen where they are in terms of size and influence, because one of the consequences is, as we learned from Dr. Summers, the industry that supports them, the university educational industry, is shortchanging half the tax-paying population, the boys. So we're facing something here which is perhaps the startling rediscovery of the obvious. There is a decline of males. All the data support this. There continue to be studies done by, as Dr. Summers said, associations determining that, for example, in Canada, there was recently a study indicating that there's still a shortfall in the number of 17-year-old women who are eager to take a 5-year apprenticeship course in order to become a welder. And the reason there's a shortfall is that there's something wrong with the social system. We're keeping them back. Have you noticed this phalanx of people keeping young welder women out of the labor force? But what has happened is that the sexual issue has been overtaken by bureaucratic statistical lawyers. And they love nothing more than a small anomaly which can become the whole discussion of males and females in the broader context. And in fact, it's a destructive phenomenon. One of the results has been what I've called in The Decline of Males, a new kinship system. Burogamy. A mother a child, and an official. And those women who don't have husbands, who may have other means of support, obviously their parents, for one, nonetheless are part of a system that is actually predominant almost in many parts of Europe and becoming so here, where women know that, okay, I don't particularly fancy Greg, he's a little unreliable and he's a bit of a nerd, as we heard from Moses earlier, so I'll enroll for benefits, and there's something else that is not clear. The Atlantic article that Moses mentioned, not particularly good because it doesn't know any biology. The writer is merely going on about the politics, but not about the biology. The fact is that there is, for the first time, a pattern of people who are able to try to choose the sex of their offspring. It's very tricky to do, it doesn't always work, but those that have a choice prefer females. And why would that be? If any of you are parents, you've already indicated a fatal interest in offspring, and you know what? You probably want to have grandchildren. And if you want to have a grandchild that you know is yours, not Greg or his friend, but yours, have a daughter. I had an interesting thing, and I hadn't planned to talk about this, but a woman named Barbara Seaman wrote a very important book called A Doctor's Case Against the Pill. And I had been telling her my harebrained notion about the impact of the pill on behavior. She thought it was ridiculous, totally ridiculous. And she was not the first person to tell me this. About 10 years later, about 2 a.m. in the morning, I received the first and only phone call I've ever had from Barbara Seaman. I woke up groggily, and who's this? Oh, it's Barbara Seaman. You were right. I'm always inclined to enjoy being told I'm right, maybe even at 2 a.m., but I said, Barbara, this is a little eccentric, can you tell me why? She said, oh yes, I'm in the maternity ward of a hospital, and I have to tell you that the parents of girls are much happier than the parents of boys. And Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, who teach at McMaster, once did an absolutely brilliantly simple study. They went to maternity ward after maternity ward, and they just watched what happened. Here's this little Michelin man in a container with tubes and whatever. The parents and relatives of the mother would say to the parents and relatives and putative father of the boys, oh, looks just like you. What an insult. The fact is that what we in biology call paternity certainty remains an important issue. It used to drive all of the kinship systems, the chador and the chastity belts and so on. We no longer, unless we're in the kind of culture which continues to tolerate that, we no longer do that. But the fact is that in order to understand what's happening to males and their decline, we have to look at that basic biology, the reproductive strategy of both males and females, and start looking with both a sense of wonder and a sense of respect for what is going on, and please, no more ideology. Thank you.